All right, so good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Node.js lecture in Rolling Scope School. And today's lecture might be a surprise for some people in this run, because we've already had a homework, presumably, that involves command line, maybe some debugging, etc., etc. However, the intent of this lecture will be a bit different from what we've discussed so far, since for most of us, getting introduced into a new set of features, frameworks, etc., into a new technology tends to be a more project-oriented. All the previous lectures were actually aimed at providing the backend experiences. Most of us kind of familiar with working with APIs on the front end. However, command line is something that defines a general purpose language, in my opinion, because it allows us to access all those language compilation and language execution features that are present in other languages, common purpose language, general purpose languages, but not necessarily available directly when working with JavaScript in browsers. So without further ado, this is me again, your host for today's lecture, and this is what we're going to discuss for the next hour or so. So we'll look into command line arguments. Where do we have those arguments? Arguments of what specifically? We'll learn how to parse command line arguments with something that is quite often used when we talk about command line packages, which is a helper library commander. We'll enable debug, or learn how to enable at least debug output for built-in packages. We'll discuss in a new light already mentioned a debug package, and we'll see how Node.js, being a kind of like an ancestor of JavaScript in browsers, is able to go back to browsers and do some debugging there. We mentioned that already, but in today's lecture, we'll be covering how to actually do that. So, command line arguments. Most of you might be familiar with process object, global object that we have access to when we work with our environment. And this is actually an object that has a name for where our server is executing. It's a process. So whenever we write a JavaScript backend application, Node.js, it launches a specific process. For those who are unfamiliar with how it works, it's not just an executed one-time thing that somehow runs. The way it runs is through a special process that is spawned specifically to host that JavaScript code execution. So process has lots of different features as an object in Node.js. We might have seen that already either in production projects or in our personal experience, process.env, env, that stands for environment, that it has access to those environment variables that we pass to our process as a way to communicate with the code that will be executed from the outside world. And that is one mechanism to pass something down to a process. However, there's another one, which is passing arguments to the execution script. So if you treat our Node.js server as not an environment to execute JavaScript, but as an actual process, as a script that we execute that just keeps running and running, a typical thing to do is to pass all those parameters at the launch time, not at the build time, as we do with environment variables usually. But think of it as another way to do the same thing, essentially. Have some dynamic properties in your code, in your script, and fill in those properties with some useful information from the outside of your basic script. To do that, we either use a process.argv object directly to access those variables that we pass, and there will be not only our own variables, but everything that we see in the execution. It'll contain a path to the Node.js executable that actually takes our code in the file, which will be the script, and then everything else would be your own variables, your own arguments that you pass there, and they will be passed as strings. But to avoid all the clutter and all the mess that we sometimes have when working with arguments directly from process.argv, we can use something like Commander. It's a high-level abstraction over those command line interfaces. It has some roots in other general-purpose language, Ruby, and it simplifies the flow. For those people who are familiar with Ruby or any other languages, it'll be a bit more less tedious to grab those values. So instead of knowing the intrinsic details how the process works in Node.js, you just directly work with the interface instead. So key features of Commander package is it has options as well as aliases to kind of avoid typing again and again same information. There are mandatory options or required options, default ones, default values, some post and pre-processing, some subcommands, so we can kind of create a chain of commands that do different things to create a richer CLI experience that we might be familiar with when working with other packages that are already written for us. And this is how it looks. So when you think about creating your own script and avoid lots of internal JavaScript details that other people, other developers or users of your script should be aware of, you create a nice interface to mimic those packages that are already there, like NPM or any package that you're familiar with, like Docker might be, AWS CLI tool. All those CLI tools, they have well-known commands, for example, help, and all those shortcuts that instead of writing --help, you can write just -h to do the same. So Commander allows you to kind of declaratively provide the interface description, and those parameters, they will be outputted when you type a certain command that Commander will pass and understand. That's how it looks from the internals of your package perspective. And that's how it looks when you actually use it inside. So as you can see, just by looking at this script, we have a certain number of parameters. They all follow a very typical for CLI or command line interface experience in terms of they have shortcuts. They can be singletons or single arguments that work as Boolean values. They can be strings, and those strings you expected to follow with an actual value. Sometimes there is an equal sign there, but that's like just like a common thing, common way of providing options into your package. And going back to the previous slide, we see how it's organized. So Commander have an options method that expects you to give it some kind of aliases for all the values of arguments, the keys, and then provides a description so that when you use the actual Commander provided help method, it will output all the options and provide some experience for those options. There is a special syntax that it follows for parsing, and this is how it looks like. So the value will actually correspond to the option that you have. You'll potentially have a higher level of control over your options. So if you want to, instead of saving it as a value, somehow transform it, as you remember, transforming is an essential thing when we talk about Node.js, like streams, readable, transform, and then writable streams. Something similar to here. So it has some readable part, and then it has a transformation part, which is optional, some defaulting for that, and the output would be your own internal RAM memory. I have a question. How does all this maps to program.object, program.bool, program.default, etc.? As you can see, we have those names. They will be passed with values, special syntax that Commander follows, kind of. And then you will have those arguments, those keys, be available directly in the program object so that you have a nice kind of interface. So these are not kind of reserved words. These are your values that you specified here. So yeah, I see where you're going with that. That's not like particularly clear. Let's take a look at other examples. Yeah, this is the help option that I mentioned already. So hopefully we'll find how that negative bool maps to the actual value. That was a long time ago. I did this screenshot actually. So negative bool, no negative bool. Yeah, that's actually strange. There might be a typo here. Yeah, we'll see. So no worries. Yeah, as you can see, there's also a, some kind of conversion problem with a not a number. Let's see. Yeah, we're providing a R42, and since we're passing it as int with a base 10, it gets us a none. That makes sense. But the actual mapping is a good question. It seems that there is a typo in this one. It should not be no, and the dashes are also a question. Let's see. So as I mentioned, we've not discussed the help or we're not described help methods in our own code. But help is a very common way to work with CLI tools. So it is provided by default by Commander, or otherwise you'd better write one when you create it without any help library, because it's a common way that people will try to use your CLI tool, and it outputs just like a map of all the values with their description, relative description, to show how it could be used. All right. Yeah, so as I already mentioned, there are quite a lot of ways to create particular kind of like command line options with Commander. We either make it all kind of like internal, or forgot the word. So where they use the option property or option method to kind of do it inline, yeah, that's exactly inline. Or we have a finite level of control when using the actual dot command method that could be chained with different descriptions and actual actions that should be applied to those commands. Same level of parsing there. So yeah, I think we discussed everything here. There are a number of options that we can have with this package. It's a really useful one. There are other packages. For some people, Commander could be a too bloated one, but at least you are saved using this library from actually going and parsing those string of key value pairs or just simple strings that you have when you access the process.args object. So nothing, yeah, and as you can see, for specific parameters, they're not just for reading and saving your parameters or values in memory under specific names. They're also could be used to actually run some code that could be doing something useful internally. So that's what we have here. So when we hit run, or we provide the run command, it is applying the migration. So let's take a look. We are executing Node.js run with help. It provides some description for that. And it will, there's no mention of, oh yeah, that's help. So I was expecting it will be executed. Yeah, so just to summarize, with command line options or command line interfaces, you are providing a nice experience, a generic experience for everyone using your script as a CLI tool in a terminal. When you have access to process.argv, you will be either using that as your main way to pass all these variables, and that's your responsibility, or you can rely on something like Commander or a number of options to cover all those tools, all those parsing problems. However, it's an additional package that you might not planning to include. So a really nice thing to have. Probably most of you are already familiar with that since we had a related task already. But yeah, time to move on. So debugging. So we've already mentioned in the logging lecture that we should be logging, and there are a number of ways to do that. And one of the easiest way that we have access to is console.log, so console object with lots of different log levels, but very primitive ones, and they're just outputting either simple strings with some interpolation as we have in generic languages, or something more rare but still present like table, etc., etc. That's could be enough. However, as with logging, when we do logging in production, we don't usually use console logs in production because of the limitation and simplicity. Same comes to debugging. We can use console log to kind of just log out everything sequentially when we want to look for potential problems. That's our responsibility to pass all those objects, to play around and go around all those limitations the console log has with its serialization. We might be familiar with object problem. So that's something, an intended way to do debugging in Node.js, nor it's a very convenient way to do that because of the serialization problem. So we need to do that as real programmers do with other languages. For example, in Visual Studio for C# or C++ or any of those family languages, they have an access to IDE that is able to do that for us. Yeah, we do have something like WebStorm or other tools, but they're not that popular. And since we are working with JavaScript primarily as a scripting language, there are essentially not that many kind of like demands to have those tools available all the time. But we do still need some breakpoint access and kind of like ability to do similar things because they are very useful. So on the one hand, we have problem that JavaScript is not really compilable, so there are no IDE support among all the developers. On the other hand, having some breakpoints is very nice and smooth experience. But the main problem with Node.js is that it's actually on the back end. So back in the days, we've solved the problem of scripting language and all those debugging with breakpoints using our browsers. However, now when we're outside of browsers, that's actually not a very convenient thing, and we either need to move to some other tools like IDEs to do the debugging, or we can actually go around and go back to Chrome, to your browser, your favorite browser, to do the debugging there. So a couple of options, one of which is to have some debugging enabled by default in Node.js. So we have an ability to enable debugging in some of the packages. So when launching a script with Node.js, we've mentioned in the beginning of this lecture that there is a number of ways to provide some configurations to a running environment, to a runtime, one of which is arguments, and that's primarily to your arguments to your own code, or environment variables. And there are a number of ways to set those environment variables, either into your code or some default ones. So we might have seen node-env as a way to specify what type of environment we're running our code in, development or production. Another option that is might be familiar to you is a node debug, and then it expects you to provide name of the package. It should correspond to the name of the package that you want to debug internally. One small caveat, it's not just any package that you require. It is a primary way to debug built-in packages like HTTP. It will provide you with more fine-grained kind of view of logs there. You'll be able to at least see how it executes. So I encourage you to try it. Another way to do the same thing, so have more ability to do debugging, is to have that debugging package available to you. It has a number of features, as we've discussed already, but the ones that we want to actually focus on now is to how it is related to the same environment variable configuration that we just mentioned with node debug. With that node debug, we were able to debug built-in parameters or built-in packages, sorry. With the debug package, we are essentially exposing another environment variable called debug. Then we provide the name of the package. It's not necessarily a build one. And then we'll see some logs outputted for us. So as you can see, I'm focusing on express package. I'm executing my script that uses that express package, and I'm able to kind of intercept most of the things that are happening inside Express and see some logs with colored output. So that's kind of where the debug package has the main purpose. So it's not just logging solution, simplistic logging solution, a step up from console log. And it's not primitive, it's not limited to just built-in packages. The main purpose is to debug any package with a nice output, and then those logs will be colored. You can view nicely what's going on to see where your requests, for example, are failing. And the third option that we might have is debugging with our browsers. That is a primer way to have a finer grained control over where you want to see something going on, because with Express debugging of using debug package, you are mostly focusing on the requests and internals like headers that Express has. Same with Node debug option. But if you want to have some kind of ability to see what is inside the variable, for example, you might want to use those breakpoints from other general purpose languages or from your front-end experience. And to do that, we have an option to provide an argument, a Boolean argument, inspect, to our node environment. It might be different. This flag has gone through some changes recently, so consult the documentation for that. But what it does, it launches a specific process, a specific server on top of your own code that is able to be open in browsers. It will use a WebSockets protocol to kind of like transfer all those information or control that you have in your browsers to the actual code and back and forth. So that's a good thing. And this is how it looks. Essentially, when you enable that, you also will see some changes connected when you kind of go to the inspect in Chrome. You will see the changes and you'll see the connection to your own process. That will keep that connection open through a WebSocket protocol. You will have access to your localhost file that is currently running there. And there in the file, you will be able to see the codes running. And from this point, it is the same as doing some breakpoint debugging in your typical front-end application. So just set the breakpoints, relaunch your project, see what's inside every variable, etc., etc. This is how it looks like. So a really nice way, handy way. You might have had some experience doing that on front end. So simply just running Node with inspect will give you that experience. There are a number of options that are available for those kind of like Chrome debugging experiences. So Node inspect spawns a child process. So it is similar to the inspect flag, where main purpose to run the CLI debugger. So instead of actually going into your browser, you're doing the same thing, but in your CLI. Same here, it's just an option to provide a port there, so you kind of have an ability to do that. It is kind of the same thing happens and is available for other options for Chrome. For example, that might be helpful when you're running several different applications at the same time. For example, a multi-service architecture, and you want to do debugging instead of actually using a default option and default host of your own convenience. There are options that you can provide with host and ports, etc., etc. And yeah, at this point, I am done with this part of the lecture. There are some useful links as usual. However, that was main intention, is to provide you with a deeper understanding of how command line works, because it's a bit more boring than just writing your own backend with endpoints, etc., etc. That's not what people usually do when they start with Node. So that's why we have it here, and also debugging of your application at the same, again, the same reason it is here, to provide a deeper understanding for people who are already familiar with all those endpoints and other terminology of writing your Node.js backend, and want to go a bit deeper than just console logging everything all the time. So, do you have any questions so far? I have an off-topic question. Why middleware functions are named so? Usually middleware reference to web app server like Nginx, Tomcat, etc. Because middleware is not a name specific to Express. It's an actual pattern. Same goes to something like state. State is not some internal thing that we use in our front-end framework applications. Vue, Angular, or React. State is a pattern, state pattern, that so the same logic applies to middleware. You talking about Nginx and Tomcat, and that's a realm of system design, not an actual programming domain. So it's not just a programming design pattern. So we have design patterns that are primarily described as in the Gang of Four book. So that's a programming thing. System designers and system design in general as a area of expertise, they have their own patterns. Architecture, similar thing. In architecture, middleware can be anything like BFF. We sometimes call those middleware in the architecture as BFFs. You might be familiar with that, backend for front end. So that's just a name of the pattern, something that is there to provide changes without actual doing any business-related logic, and it could be at the server level, at the system level, so wider scope, and the architecture level. Hopefully that was clear enough. All right. So, since you don't have any questions, I thank you again for coming to this lecture, and see you next week in our final lecture, where we'll discuss a bit more hard-code things like authentication. Right? So, have a nice weekend, everyone. Bye.